Harvard Divinity School.
Roundtable on Eduardo Matos Moctezuma's death in Mesoamerica, October 3rd, 2024.
So welcome everyone to the Harvard Divinity School for this special Mesa Redonda on the book Death in Mesoamerica by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, edited and translated by Scott Sessions. I'm David Carrasco, the Neil Rudenstein Professor for the Study of Latin America. And this afternoon's event is part of a two-day celebration of the Eduardo Matos Moctezuma Cátedra lecture series, the first in Harvard's 388-year history to be named after a Mexican intellectual. Which will culminate tomorrow evening with Leonardo López Luján's lecture, The Archaeology of Tenochtitlan, an Overview, between 6 and 7 p.m. in the Geological Lecture Hall on 24 Oxford Street. These events are co-sponsored by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, the Moses Mesoamerican Archive, and the Harvard Divinity School. I want to especially thank Julian Cancino, Director of the Mexico Studies Program at Doctor Class. In the back, raise up your hand, Julian, por favor. It's Julian Cancino. I also want to thank Sarah Faber, Manager of the Mesoamerican Archive, right here. I don't know if Kate Royce is here. Is Kate Royce here? Kate Royce is from the Office of Academic Affairs at HDS for their collaborative efforts. And also thanks to Bob DeVoe in the back for support with the IT challenges we always face. We always express gratitude to our Mexican patrons, Jose Antonio Alonso and Karen Beckman, who have supported the Matos Cátedra financially and with very memorable hospitality during Harvard's visit to Mexico City. I believe they're on the way in. But before we go forward with our Mesa Redonda, I ask that my longtime friend and collaborator, Professor Jose Cuellar, anthropologist, musician, and past Hertie Fellow in the Peabody Museum, to provide us with the musical blessing via his flutes.
Muchísimas gracias, David. Thank you so much. All my relations, Jose Cuellar, Chicano from Texas. And I'm so honored and humbled to be here. It's been 40-something years that I've had the opportunity to work and to observe these men at work. And in the process, they've influenced my thinking in many ways. Today, I'd like to thank them and acknowledge and appreciate what they've done by combining several elements of Mesoamerican recognition and a Pan-American tradition of recognizing and acknowledging the directions and the energies that come to us, a uniquely American phenomenon. So with your kind permission, I'd like to ask you to direct your attention to the east and think of the energies, and I want to express my acknowledgement and appreciation for the energies that we associate with those energies that have been carried on by these individuals. Inspiration, innovation, invention. For them and for all of us, I pray. Ho, Matakuyash. To the west, when we think of the west, we think of the women, warriors, and the energies that we get from that courage, commitment, comfort. Oh, Mitakuyash. To the south, we think of youth, creativity, curiosity, critiques. And we appreciate the youth that are here. And we appreciate those of us that are elders who are maintaining their youth for them and for you. To the north, we think of the elders, the ancestors, those that have transitioned over the years. The last 40 years, we had so many folks that have been part of this mesa redonda, this exchange, where we brought folks in the center and the periphery to share their ideas. And we think of the elders that have left us but are here still with us, influencing the way we think, the way we approach things. Thank you so much, my relations.
So I hope all of you will have a chance later to see close up the posters in the easels in the back of the room, because they represent an innovation in the Mesoamerican Archive's work. Since its origins, the Mesoamerican Archive and Research Project has created bridges between Mexican and American studies and scholars, fostering a fruitful and innovative exchange of ideas, arts, and knowledge. This year, through the initiatives of Harvard's very own Citlali Sanchez, we have deepened our commitment by collaborating with the Universidad Iberoamericana, a premier academic institution in Mexico City. For the past month, 12 graphic design students, led by Professor David Guerrero, responded to the archive's call to produce an exhibition celebrating the Eduardo Matos Moctezuma Cátedra. The 28 posters that appear in this slideshow capture the original designs of this amazing group of students. And today we enjoy their work as they and the Matos Cátedra showcase the relevance and contributions of Mexico's archaeology and its contribution to the world. I also want to recognize an extraordinary colleague and friend, Charlene Higbe, who is sitting right over here. Who has just retired after over 20 years of superb work, first as a faculty assistant in the Harvard Divinity School, and then as manager of the Moses Mesoamerican Archive. The international success of the Matos Cátedra, which included 4 major lectures at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and several at Harvard before and during COVID, has been largely due to Charlene's excellent managerial skills, her people skills, and good humor. Without knowing more than a few words in Spanish, she arranged all the meetings, travel, hotels, meals, video recording, photography, lectures, publicity, and perhaps above all, managed me with the effective results. We were office mates for a number of years, and her critical thinking, wise counsel, budget wrangling, and ability to work with HDS and doctor class personnel turned it all into labors of caretaking, wonderful public events, and learning opportunities for Harvard deans, professors, vice provosts, and most importantly, students who went with us on our learning journeys to Mexico. As a token of appreciation, I commissioned the sensational Mexican-American artist, George Yepes, to produce the painting you see on the screen for her, which is now being framed so that Charlene can have a beautiful, inspiring image of caretaking to remind her of our collaborations and her great work with us. I recall what Estee Lauder once said, "I never dreamt of success, I worked for it." Or Charlene's mantra, whenever I was puzzled about which direction to go, she'd say, "Well, David, we just make it up as we go." With Charlene, it was about both the dream of building bridges over walls and the work of new knowledge. And as we carry on our work in the protective light of all you did for us, here and in Mexico, please know, Charlene, that we wish that some of your dreams are fulfilled in the days and years ahead. You made a positive difference. I remember that near the end of each workday, as you prepared for a long trip back to your home at the Cape, you would say, "Well, it's time to roll up my sidewalk and go." Thank you very much for all the sidewalks you guided us down and kept us safe. An applause for Charlene Higbe.
I only want to say how grateful I am for the many wonderful people I have met along the way, the places I have been. I sound like a Dr. Seuss book, but it has been a remarkable, remarkable time. I realized that with all of the changes that we've had with the pandemic and working arrangements and that sort of thing, that it was time to bring some files and things back that I had taken home in March of 2020. Thank you, Zoom, for keeping us all connected during that time. And I realized also that I still had the keys to the archive, so I give them back. And just to say that, sadly, I still haven't learned more than a few words of Spanish, but I think I can say, muchas gracias para una gran aventura.
Excellent, excellent. The audience will want to know that at a later gathering, we will be celebrating the extraordinary and I must say unique achievements of the late Mexican historian Alfredo López Austin, a longtime beloved colleague of all of us on this stage. With his wife, sons, and grandchildren here, we will be presenting the inaugural Alfredo López Austin Award for Excellence in Mesoamerican Studies to none other than the exceptional archaeologist Ximena Chávez, who is with us today. Let's have a round of applause for Alfredo and for Ximena. So we now turn to the main substance of this gathering. First of all, a presentation by the Cátedra's namesake, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, followed by the Roundtable on his death in Mesoamerica. Let me say a few words about him. The magnet who draws us together today is Eduardo, considered a national treasure in Mexico, symbolized in his membership in the Colegio Nacional, the honorary academy that brings together the country's foremost artists and scholars. He's given over 1,000 public lectures and is author to enough books to build his own library. Wait a second. Where's the next thing? He has been honored by universities and governments in Latin America, Asia, Europe, and the US because of his intellectual and organizational genius. He's guided generations of hardworking, brilliant Mexican archaeologists down through the centuries of stratigraphy to find symbols and secrets, temples and terror, monuments and miniatures of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Just 3 quick stories about him, all from cab drivers in Mexico City. When I would arrive in the city, I would be taken by a cab driver to where I was staying, and inevitably they'd ask me, well, what are you doing here? And I'd always say, to kind of lift up my own prestige in their eyes, oh, I have a little work at the Templo Mayor. And the first cab driver said, Matos lives at the Templo Mayor all the time, night and day. That's his home. The second cab driver said to me, he's there protecting the Aztec gold from the government. But the one I liked the best, and I think really tells us his significance to the Mexican people, is when the cab driver said to me, he taught us Mexicans who we are. He taught us Mexicans who we are. Here's the teacher. Please welcome Eduardo Matos Moctezuma.
Gracias, hermano. Gracias, hermano. Dos hermanos. Considero al Proyecto Templo Mayor la principal investigación arqueológica que he llevado a cabo en mi vida. ¿Cómo no va a ser así cuando por poco más de 45 años a ella me he dedicado? Mi agradecimiento a don Gastón García Cantú, por entonces director del Instituto de Antropología, quien puso en mis manos aquel proyecto cuando solo contaba con 37 años de edad. Mucho tiempo ha pasado y los recuerdos de todo tipo llegan a mi memoria, cuando tuve que decir frente al presidente de la República y al secretario de Asentamientos Humanos y Obras Públicas que los vestigios arquitectónicos que fueron apareciendo no serían reconstruidos, corriente que muchos de mis maestros y colegas habían puesto en práctica y con la que siempre estuve en contra.
I consider the principal archaeological investigation I have undertaken in my life to be the Templo Mayor project. How could it be otherwise after dedicating a little more than 45 years to it? I thank Gaston Garcia Cantu, then director of INA, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, who put that project in my hands when I was only 37 years old. Many years have passed and all sorts of memories come to mind, like the time I had to inform the President of Mexico and the Secretary of Human Settlements and Public Works that the architectural remains of the Great Temple coming to light would not be reconstructed, a current practice many of my teachers and colleagues had been implementing, which I was always against.
La visita de los reyes de España, don Juan Carlos y doña Sofía, me llevó a pensar la mejor manera de decirles que todos aquellos vestigios que se presentaban ante sus ojos habían sido destruidos por España. Después de muchas cavilaciones, encontré la fórmula para salir del problema. Después del recorrido, llegamos a una habitación en la que habíamos colocado varias piezas importantes encontradas en las excavaciones. Después de decir algo sobre ellas, comenté: como sus majestades saben, todo esto fue destruido por España. Ya ven cómo eran estos Austria. Claro, los distinguidos visitantes eran Borbones. El rey lanzó una carcajada y dijo: usted debería ser ministro de Relaciones Exteriores. A lo que le contesté: pues dígaselo a ese señor, señalando al presidente López Portillo. Nunca me nombró en el cargo.
A visit from the King and Queen of Spain, Don Juan Carlos y Doña Sofia, got me thinking that it would be best to tell them all that the ruins appearing before their eyes had been destroyed by Spain. After considerable pondering, the way out of my predicament came to me. Following the tour, I brought them all to a room where we had arranged several important pieces found in the excavations. After briefly commenting on the pieces, I said, as your majesties know, all of this was destroyed by Spain. Now you see how those Austrians were. Of course, these distinguished royal visitors were Bourbons. The king burst out laughing and said, "You should be Minister of Foreign Relations." To which I responded, "Tell that to the gentleman," pointing to President Lopez Portillo. He never named me to the position.
En fin, muchas son las vivencias que experimenté a lo largo de más de 4 décadas y no podría referirme a todas ellas, pero recuerdo con detalle un día en que a las puertas de las excavaciones del Templo Mayor llegó un joven muy alto, tanto en altura física como en sabiduría, que me abordó y me dijo que si me acordaba de él. Claro que sí, le contesté. En efecto, tiempo atrás se había presentado este personaje a mi oficina del Departamento de Monumentos Prehispánicos, portando una carta de mi entrañable y admirado amigo Pedro Armillas, en la que me solicitaba que atendiera a este joven estudioso de las religiones en la Universidad de Chicago. Al preguntarle qué deseaba, me contestó: quiero un permiso para pasar una noche en Tula. Ante tan curiosa respuesta pensé, bueno, si quiere ir allá para que lo piquen los mosquitos, pues adelante, y le extendí el permiso. Este relato lo comenté en el homenaje que se le hizo a David Carrasco por parte de sus colegas y alumnos en Nueva Orleans el 3 de marzo de 2023.
All told, I could not possibly recount the many experiences I had during those 4 decades or so. But I do remember in great detail the day when a young man, towering in both physical stature and learning, appeared at the gates of the Templo Mayor excavations, approached me, and asked if I remembered him. I replied, of course I did. In fact, sometime earlier, this person had come to my office at the Department of Pre-Hispanic Monuments with a letter from my dearly admired friend, Pedro Armillas, who asked me to tend to this young scholar of religions from the University of Chicago. When I asked the young man what he wanted, he replied, I'd like permission to spend the night at Tula. Faced with such a curious request, I thought, well, if he wants to go there and get bitten by mosquitoes, then go ahead. So I gave him my permission. I told this story at the tribute paid to David Carrasco by his colleagues and students in New Orleans on March 3rd, 2023.
Aquel encuentro fue el comienzo de una amistad que dura hasta el presente. Muchos fueron los eventos en los que colaboramos juntos: la creación del Mesoamerican Archive, las mesas redondas en las que participaban distinguidos estudiosos del México prehispánico, muchos de ellos hoy ausentes, como son los casos del mismo Armillas, John Hogg, Paul Whitley, Doris Hayden, Charles Long, Alfredo López Austin. También el momento de exposiciones como aquella que se llevó a cabo en Denver sobre materiales del Templo Mayor y Tlatelolco. Por cierto, se contó con el aporte de la Universidad de Colorado, Boulder, para las excavaciones de Tlatelolco, gracias a las gestiones hechas por David. También recibí el doctorado honoris causa de esta universidad, el que me fue otorgado en ciencias y no en humanidades. Creo que se les había acabado las de humanidades y por eso me dieron el de ciencias.
That encounter that day in my office was the beginning of a friendship that has lasted to this day. We have collaborated together on many events, including the creation of the Mesoamerican Archive, the roundtables in which distinguished scholars of pre-Hispanic Mexico participated, many of them no longer with us, such as Armillas himself, John Hogg, Paul Wheatley, Doris Hayden, Charles Long, and Alfredo Lopez Austin. And the mounting of exhibitions such as the one held in Denver of materials from the Templo Mayor and Tlatelolco. Incidentally, we got support from the University of Colorado Boulder for the Tlatelolco excavations thanks to David's efforts. I also received an honorary doctorate from that university, which was awarded to me in the sciences, not the humanities.
Cuando David llegó a la Universidad de Princeton y después a la de Harvard, continuamos con nuestra colaboración y fruto de ella fue la instauración de la Cátedra Eduardo Matos Moctezuma Lecture Series en esta última universidad, programada para 5 años que se prolongaron a 8, contando con el apoyo de José Antonio Alonso Espinosa, hoy aquí presente con su esposa Karen. Quiero mencionar las instituciones que forman parte de la Universidad de Harvard que apoyaron esta iniciativa: el Museo Peabody, la Divinity School, el David Rockefeller Center of Latin American Studies y desde luego al Mesoamerican Archive Rafael y Fletcher Lee Moses bajo la dirección de David Carrasco. También quiero mencionar al doctor Bill Fash por su apoyo constante.
Our collaboration continued after David went to Princeton and then Harvard, resulting in the establishment of the Eduardo Matos Moctezuma Lecture Series for 5 years, which were extended to 8 with the generous support of Jose Antonio Alonso. The Harvard institutions that sustained this initiative were the Peabody Museum, the Divinity School, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and of course, the Raphael and Fletcher Lee Moses Mesoamerican Archive and Research Project under the direction of David Carrasco. I also want to acknowledge the constant support of Dr. Bill Fash.
Mención especial merecen quienes participaron como parte de la cátedra misma que acordamos fueran 2 sesiones al año, una conferencia en México y otra en Harvard, comenzando con la primera que me correspondió abrir en el Museo Nacional de Antropología en la Ciudad de México en el año 2017. Después la inauguré en Harvard. En ambos casos hablé sobre el Proyecto Templo Mayor y expuse la idea sobre los 2 ejes de vida y muerte que, a partir de este edificio, se extienden paralelamente a lo largo del recinto sagrado hacia el poniente.
Deserving special mention are those who participated in the lecture series, which we agreed would consist of 2 sessions per year, one in Mexico, the other at Harvard, the first of which I opened in 2017 at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and then Harvard. In both instances, I spoke about the Templo Mayor project and presented my idea that the 2 axes of life and death extend from this building in a parallel manner westward along the sacred precinct.
De inmediato empezamos a invitar, siempre de común acuerdo entre David y yo, a destacados miembros de la arqueología, la historia, la literatura y la conservación. Los nombres de Alfredo López Austin, Diana Magaloni, Juan Villoro, Javier García Diego, Ann Cyphers, Laura Fillol y Leonardo López Luján completan la lista de tan distinguidos académicos. Aquí es importante reconocer a la revista Arqueología Mexicana, única en su género, la que asumió el compromiso de publicar en números especiales las ponencias de los participantes. Mi agradecimiento a Marinieves Autrey y a mi colega, el arqueólogo Enrique Vela.
Immediately, David and I, always by mutual agreement, began inviting outstanding figures in archaeology, history, literature, and museology. The names of Alfredo López Austin, Diana Magaloni, Juan Villoro, Javier García Diego, Ann Cyphers, Laura Filloy, and Leonardo López Luján complete the list of distinguished speakers. Here, it is also important to acknowledge the Archeologia Mexicana magazine, the only one of its kind, which committed to publish each of the lectures in special issues, for which I thank Marinieves Autry and my archaeologist colleague, Enrique Vela.
Siempre me ha gustado hablar del alfa y la omega, el principio y el fin. Mañana, por voluntad propia, llega a su término la cátedra. No es casualidad que hayamos comenzado con conferencias sobre el Templo Mayor de Tenochtitlan y que terminemos hablando, en la voz de Leonardo, sobre Tenochtitlan y el Templo Mayor. En alguna ocasión, Leonardo me pidió que él deseaba ser el último participante en la cátedra. Hoy es llegado el momento de cerrar el círculo. Recuerdo mis palabras que dije en aquella velada memorable en su ingreso al Colegio Nacional, cuando después de una brillante exposición que llevó por título Pretérito Pluscuamperfecto, leí mi mensaje de bienvenida.
I've always liked talking about the idea of Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Tomorrow, the Eduardo Matos Moctezuma lecture series will run its natural course and come to an end. It is not by chance that it began with lectures on the great temple of Tenochtitlan and will end by talking in Leonardo's voice about Tenochtitlan and the great temple. At some point, Leonardo mentioned to me that he wished to give the last lecture in the series. Now it is time to close the circle. I remember my words of welcome on the memorable evening of his induction into the Colegio Nacional following his brilliant presentation entitled Past Pluperfect.
Mis palabras fueron las siguientes. Siempre he pensado que llega un momento en que hay que dejar paso a los jóvenes y con ellos a las nuevas ideas y aportes de una disciplina que se transforma constantemente. Debe uno hacerse a un lado para que esas ideas fluyan y vengan a enriquecer el conocimiento científico. De no hacerlo así, simplemente estaremos estorbando el avance que la disciplina merece. Sin embargo, siempre les recuerdo a las generaciones que hoy marcan el derrotero de cualquier disciplina que no olviden que lo que ahora pensamos que es lo más avanzado dentro de ella, mañana tendrá que ceder al paso del fruto de la investigación futura que con nuevos bríos echará por tierra, como ocurre en algunos casos, lo que creíamos inamovible. Es simplemente el designio de la ciencia lo que hoy prevalece, mañana puede dejar de ser.
I have always thought that there comes a time when one must give way to those younger and according to the new ideas and contributions of a discipline that is constantly changing. One must step aside so that these ideas can flow and come to enrich scientific knowledge. If this is not done, we will simply hinder the progress that the discipline deserves. Nevertheless, I always remind the generations who set the course of any discipline today not to forget that what we now think are its greatest advances tomorrow must give way to the fruits of future research that with new vigor will overthrow, as sometimes happens, what we believe to be immobile. It is simply the design of science. What prevails today may cease to be tomorrow.
La presencia en este acto de jóvenes investigadores como Ximena Chávez, Patricia Ledesma, Kris Lane, incluido el mismo Leonardo, son ejemplo claro de lo que dije en aquel momento. Mi agradecimiento a todas las personas e instituciones que a lo largo de los 45 años del Proyecto Templo Mayor han prestado su colaboración para que se alcanzaran metas tanto en la investigación como en la preservación y la difusión del mismo. Sin ellos y ellas no hubiera sido posible penetrar en el pasado para traerlo al presente.
The presence in this event of young researchers such as Ximena Chávez, Patricia Ledesma, Kris Lane, and Leonardo himself is a clear example of what I said at that time. I thank all the people and institutions that over the course of the Templo Mayor's project's 45 years have worked together to achieve goals in research as well as in the preservation of the project and its dissemination. Without them, it would not have been possible to penetrate the past and bring it into the present.
Quiero hacer un último comentario para reunir en este evento las presencias de David Carrasco, Leonardo López Luján, Alfredo López Austin y la mía propia. No somos, afortunadamente, los 4 jinetes del Apocalipsis, Por el contrario, nos une la pasión por la historia, por la arqueología, y a ellas acudimos tratando de aportar lo mejor con entrega y dedicación. El premio que por primera vez esta noche se otorga lleva el nombre de Alfredo. Es el justo reconocimiento a quien durante muchos años dedicó su vida a la investigación, lo que me llevó a escribir en el homenaje que le hicieran la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y el INA en 2013 lo siguiente: a quien de la investigación ha hecho su razón de ser.
I would like to make one final comment in this event to join the presence of David Carrasco, Leonardo López Luján, Alfredo López Austin, and myself. Fortunately, we are not the four horsemen of the apocalypse. On the contrary, we are united by our passion for history, for archaeology, and we try to contribute our best with dedication and devotion. The prize that will be awarded this evening for the first time today bears Alfredo's name. It is the just recognition of someone who, for years, has dedicated her life to research, which led me to write the tribute paid to her by INA and UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, in 2013, to one who has made research her raison d'être.
Gracias, David, Alfredo y Leonardo.
Thank you, David, Alfredo, and Leonardo.
So thank you, Eduardo. Now to move on to the responses to the book. I'm going to introduce all the speakers now so they can simply follow one another with their presentations. First of all, Scott Sessions. We call him the scribe of the Mesoamerican Archive, co-editor and author of several books with me, including the English and Spanish editions of the award-winning City, Cave, and Eagle's Nest, An Interpretive Journey Through the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan, #2. He was also the development editor of the critically acclaimed Oxford Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures. Scott will speak briefly about the work of translating and editing Death in Mesoamerica. He'll be followed by Ximena Chávez Balderas, a highly respected archaeologist, teacher, and interpreter of ritual violence in Mesoamerica. Ximena Chávez earned her PhD at Tulane University with a dissertation entitled The Offering of Life, Human and Animal Sacrifice at the West Plaza of the Sacred Precinct of Tenochtitlan. Her many awards include the Javier Romero Molina Prize for Best Doctoral Thesis in Physical Anthropology in 2020. Her new book, Violence on Display, Ideology and Political Economics of Human Sacrifice, will soon be published by Harvard's Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. She'll be followed by Leonardo López Luján, one of the leading researchers of pre-Hispanic societies and history of archaeology in Mexico. Leonardo is director of the Templo Mayor project and a member of Mexico's prestigious Colegio Nacional. He's published widely and holds a doctoral degree from the University of Paris. In 2023, he received an honorary doctorate in philosophy from the University of Copenhagen and was just made Knight of the National Order of the Legion of Honor by the French government. He will be followed by Patricia Ledesma. Since 2015, Patricia has been director of the Templo Mayor Museum and has curated several important exhibitions, such as An Offering to Xochipilli, Between the Light He Sings and the Sun Arrives, Coyoxauhqui, Astral Body, Goddess and Discovery, and Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, 500 years after their fall. In 2022, she received the Heritage and Culture Award for Women in Art from the House of Dior, the Calus Museum, and the Ruta de Galerías Association, and just appeared on the PBS in an episode of John Leguizamo's American Historia, speaking about the encounters between Spaniards and the world of Moctezuma. Kris Lane, former student of mine, fulfilling that thing about the student surpasses his teacher. He's the Francis V. Scholz Chair in Colonial Latin American History at Tulane University. specializing in the Andean region, especially the evolving and sometimes violent relationships built around mining and its manifold environmental consequences. His books include Quito, 1599, City and Colony in Transition, Color of Paradise, The Emerald in the Age of Gunpowder Empires, and Potosí, the Silver City that Changed the World. We follow now with Scott, but before he speaks, I do want to also recognize David and Luann Hempton, who are here, the former dean and deaness of the Harvard Divinity School. They were the ones who really embraced this project fully a number of years ago, traveled with us at least twice to Mexico City for the Cátedra, and has been tremendous supports to us and friends for Jose Antonio and Karen. So thank you very much, my dean. I'd always tell him, you're my favorite dean. He said, well, I'm your only dean. But that wasn't true. I had 3 or 4 other deans. He was the guy. Okay, Scott, thank you.
Thanks. Well, thank you, David, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to say a few words about the publication of Death in Mesoamerica. I would like also to thank the Moses Mesoamerican Archive, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and the Harvard Divinity School for hosting this event. I had the great fortune and pleasure of working with Eduardo Matos Moctezuma on this translation, editing, and production of this book. If I recall correctly, its inception goes back to a dinner conversation we had in Mexico City when he mentioned to me that he had a monograph he hoped would appear in English that needed translation. I suggested he send me the manuscript. The first time I met Professor Matos was in the late 80s at the University of Colorado after a public lecture on the excavations he directed at the Templo Mayor. I recall being particularly impressed by his ability to captivate the large crowd with his measured, articulate delivery and stunning 35mm slides in the days before PowerPoint, which animated the lecture and made it fully intelligible to those, even to those with little knowledge of Mexico or Spanish. After receiving the manuscript, I recognized that same communicative quality in its well-organized prose. In my experience, any serious translation, that is one that isn't merely a mechanical, literal rendering of words and syntax, requires a hermeneutical exercise that seeks to understand both the horizon and tradition of the writer and how he or she thinks, in order to make appropriate choices in terms of nuance and meaning to convey the material to the intended audience. From the start, Eduardo made it clear that he intended the work for students, although he also wished it to be accessible to general readers and useful to specialists as well. Having recently used the text in a course, I believe that I can attest to its pedagogical utility in the classroom, and perhaps other panelists will speak about the word from the perspective of their own disciplines. The original Spanish title was La Muerte entre los Mexicas, or Death Among the Mexica. But it quickly became apparent that the work's organization, coverage, and appeal seemed to be broader than just this one important group, a group popularly, though imprecisely, and not, if not notoriously known in Western discourse as the Aztecs, who conceived of and controlled the imperial island capital on the eve of its conquest by a band of Spanish marauders and a much larger force of indigenous allies led by Fernando Cortés. Although a significant amount of the data presented in the book comes from the excavated offerings and structures found in that city's ceremonial center, the author also supports his arguments and conclusions with material evidence from other Mesoamerican times and places, combined with an ensemble of alphabetic and pictographic primary sources and more recent ethnographic data to trace the evolution of various beliefs and practices surrounding death and what comes after across the long history of Mesoamerican tradition up to recent times. Thus, already in the first chapter, we not only find cosmogonic passages from the mid-16th century Nahua Codex Chimalpopoca to the Quiché Maya Popol Vuh, but also a lineage of ancient Western literary accounts ranging from the Gilgamesh epic, the Odyssey, and Old and New Testaments of the Bible, to Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Divine Comedy, all of which inform the perceptions that Roman Catholic missionaries tried to impose on native Mesoamericans during the early colonial period, perceptions that continue to influence ritual activity in Mexico and other parts of the Americas, including the popular Day of the Dead festivities. For these and other reasons, we felt the English edition would benefit from the more accessible and expansive title, Death in Mesoamerica. Another consideration involves the treatment of these primary sources that Eduardo so adeptly employs to make his case, many of them generated in languages other than Spanish. We felt it would be a disservice to students, scholars, and general readers to merely translate or retranslate the passages in the Spanish edition, especially those already available in English, without providing readers with transcriptions from the original source. The decision was made to present such passages in a separate section of source notes, appearing after the main text, which also include quoted material from scholars expressed in languages other than English. A special case concerns the Florentine Codex, which contains testimony from Nahua elders collected by the 16th century Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún and his indigenous students, which is employed to great effect, especially in the 4th chapter, to illuminate various funerary beliefs and practices involved with the death of male warriors and prospective mothers during childbirth, as well as merchants, commoners, nobles, and rulers, and the various places their body and souls would go post-mortem. This invaluable colonial source was arranged in corresponding Spanish and Nahuatl columns of alphabetic script, augmented with pictorial material painted by indigenous artists. Professor Matos's original edition primarily quoted from the Spanish column, which appears translated in the new edition, but the source notes also include the corresponding passages from both columns, which sometimes diverge in interesting ways. Efforts also were made to update the Spanish edition in terms of presentation, content, and the bibliography now available to Anglophone readers, as well as the compilation of a new index. In providing the source notes and updated bibliography, we hope to conveniently bring together this material for students and specialists without interrupting the flow of the main text. In the limited time I have left, I'd like to mention at least one observation that came to me while working on the book. First, being familiar with the author's masterful works on the Templo Mayor, Mexica architecture and sculpture, and the history of Mexican archaeology, I wasn't expecting such an important contribution to the general study of religion as this. At first glance, the initial chapter titled Humans, Heroes, and Gods may seem like an ambitious comparative exercise at a time when the grand theorizing of figures such as Mircea Eliade, Adolf Jensen, or Claude Lévi-Strauss has lost favor in some quarters of religious studies for alleged ahistorical or acultural tendencies. But upon closer look, one finds that the comparisons in this book are anything but arbitrary. Rather, they are genealogically linked in terms of history and culture, either in Mesoamerica or the West, or in the fateful collision of the two in 16th century Mexico, admirably discussed in the 5th chapter titled Devils on the Loose. And when relenting such theoretical insights to the Mesoamerican evidence, Professor Matos is quick to point out the differences as well as the similarities according to the unique cultural and historical circumstances of such manifestations, thus combining the materialist training of an archaeologist with the language and tools from the history of religions. Professor Matos has developed an effective methodology for interpreting the ensemble of data that he presents. In addition, the author's cogent and concise discussions of duality, the creation of the calendar, and the conceptions of the universe and the human body in the second and third chapters, read through the lens of death, results in one of the most effective introductory overviews of religion in Mesoamerica that I have seen. Finally, I would like to thank Professor Matos for the opportunity to work on this project and hope that this modest effort to bring this offering to the Anglophone world has warranted the trust that he placed in me. And hopefully this publication by the Moses Mesoamerican Archive here at Harvard will be followed by other editions of important works by Mexican scholars in the near future. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us to celebrate Eduardo Matos Moctezuma and Alfredo López Austin. Mesoamerican cosmovision of death stands on the foundations of life. In words of Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, we find ourselves facing the paradox of life and death. Through death comes life, and life leads to death. It is the life cycle that occurs day after day, year after year. This duality derives from the observation of the world, the succession of dry and rainy season, the growth of crops and their consumption, the replacement of the old generation by the new ones, the cohesion of seeds with bones, and so forth. Death is a recurring topic in Mesoamerican cosmovision, in calendar, crops, birth, myths, poetry, and words. For this reason, it's not surprising that Matos Moctezuma considered it to be a cult of life through death. The life-death duality, the myths of creation, the conception of funerary geographies and funerals are fascinating subjects, and there is no better scholar to guide us than Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. Like the mythical heroes that he discusses in his book, he has a close connection to death. The power of his words lies in his fascination with death, which inspired him to write about his own mortality. I remember how I was captivated by his essay, The Ritual of Time, published in a national newspaper in May of 2000. In that narrative, he visualizes his funeral as a public ritual that takes place next to the monolith of the goddess Coyolxauhqui and culminates on a funerary pyre at the foot of the Templo Mayor, as a Mexica dignitary. As mythical heroes, he has the prerogative to travel to the afterlife and back. In his book, we have the opportunity to join him on this journey and return to tell the tale. In these places reside the gods, who are defined by three characteristics. They are immortal, they can be reborn, and they have the ability to bring the dead back to life. Humans create the gods and give them attributes that are unattainable treasures for humans. Based on data from archaeology, physical anthropology, history, ethnography, iconography, and the history of religions, our journey through funerary geographies begins. This term was coined by Mircea Eliade to describe the mythical territories representing the world of the dead, either subterranean or celestial. Before taking these roads, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma reminds us that the journey actually begins on Earth, Tlaltecutli, a deity that can be represented as a male, female, or animal. One of the masterpieces of Mexica sculpture, the monolith of the goddess Tlaltecutli, discovered in the year 2006 in the West Plaza of the Sacred Precinct of Tenochtitlan, represents the earth devouring blood, but at the same time has a posture that has been interpreted as giving birth. She's both devourer and life-giver. Death occurs in the earth, and this is the place where the mortal remains are buried, regardless of the funeral treatment. It is the same earth that gives us the crops that sustain life. The earth is also the place where the 13 celestial floors converge with the 9 infraterrestrial levels that lead to the underworld. Unlike other cosmovisions, funerary geography did not depend on a person's behavior in the terrestrial world, but on the way they die. It was believed that those who perish from water-related causes travel to Tlalocan, a place of fertility presided by the god of rain. Their bodies were buried directly in the ground like seeds. Infants traveled to a nursing tree, although there is no precise description of how their funerals were conducted. Warriors defeated in battle and women who died giving birth went to the heaven of the sun. The former carried the sun from dawn to the zenith, where the females receive it and take it to the sunset. Warriors, or their effigies, if they were not recovered from the battlefield, were cremated, while women were buried in a special place and their corpses guarded, since it was believed that they could grant special powers to warriors and thieves. People who died of age or illness went to the underworld or Mictlan. Traditionally, it was assumed that all those who died from natural causes were cremated, as mentioned by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. However, by analyzing the accounts of other chroniclers and archaeological evidence, it is possible to conclude that cremation was an expensive treatment to which not everyone had access. Bodies were placed on a pyre along the grave goods to be burned. The fire has a transforming function, symbolic and real, which helped the dead to reach the afterlife in the most expeditious way. The funeral lasted 4 days, after which the bodies were already in a state of decomposition, and the journey through the 9 floors leading to the underworld lasted also 4 years. For Matos Moctezuma, these numbers are not arbitrary, considering that after 4 years, bodies are already skeletonized, that is, transformed into bones, which are the matter of the underworld. Skeletal reductions depends on the burial conditions and intrinsic factors. On the other hand, the number 9 is associated with the months of gestation, that is, the return to the mother's womb. On this subject, the reader will also find an interesting discussion on the influence of the European worldview on colonial narratives and pictographs relating to the passages to the underworld, in particular with Dante's Infernos. The painters of these documents master the worldview of these two worlds. For Mesoamerican cultures, and particularly for the Mexica, corpses were essential actors in both funerary and sacrificial rituals. There is strong evidence that the priests possessed detailed anatomical knowledge transmitted from generation to generation. Iconography demonstrates that these priests were familiar with the composition. In addition, the remains of sacrificial victims reveal that the priests knew musculoskeletal anatomy, and this helped them to develop strategies for processing the bodies. For example, disarticulating instead of cutting the bones, or perforating the skulls of the zompantli in the appropriate part of the bone to avoid unwanted fractures. The body disintegrates in a real and symbolic dimension. Alfredo López Austin wrote one of the most detailed studies on the human body symbolism, which was believed to be composed of soul entities. After death, 2 of them were dispersed, the tonali and the ihijot, housing the head and the liver, respectively, and another entity, the teyolia, traveled to the funerary geography determined by the manner of death. The most important part in the sacrificial rituals were precisely the head and the heart, where these soul entities were housed. During the excavation of the Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan between 1979 and 1982, 7 burials involving cremation were found, corresponding to 5 individuals. This apparent discrepancy is explained as follows. 2 Mexica dignitaries were cremated and buried in the sanctuary of Huitzilopochtli, but their remains were divided into 2 urns, most likely alluding to the duality evoked by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. One dignitary, the most important in terms of his grave goods and his location at the foot of the effigy of Huitzilopochtli, was divided into 2 urns. The remains were not complete. It represented a sort of relic that corresponded to a small percentage of the remains. Offerings 10 and 14 were also recovered in 1978. At that time, the osteological analysis of cremated remains was not developed. In spite of this, and in a visionary approach, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma realized from the beginning their meaning by proposing that they were 2 warriors. 25 years after their discovery, They were analyzed using an osteological, contextual, forensic, and microscopic approach to reach a conclusion, the same one that Eduardo Matos had proposed more than 2 decades earlier. Sex, age, and individual characteristics, including the analysis of the activity marks performed by Martelena Alfaro, revealed that these were 2 males who performed intense physical activity with their forearms as well as long walks. In addition, one of them, approximately 20 years old, had a knee injury and, despite his dental health, had lost his incisors sometime before his death, most likely due to blunt trauma. In addition, the urns in which they were buried had iconography allusive to war. Sacrificial death is the other side of the coin. Victims can be equated with objects or gifts dedicated to the gods. The remains were exposed to a diversity of treatments depending on the festivity and were reused, transforming their symbolism from victims to gods. With the arrival of the Spaniards, this changed. The early Catholic religion did not approve cremation of bodies, something that must have meant a major confrontation. How did the native population take the imposition of what to do with the bodies of their fathers, mothers, and descendants? There came a period of resistance, assimilation, and syncretism in which everything changed, including the way of disposing the bodies. Gods became demons, and dying became expensive. Corpses were no longer buried in the household, but were taken to the residence of an unknown deity. This book by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma is similar to those literary masterpieces that you can stop reading until you reach the end. I appreciate that it is available in both Spanish and English. Finally, I would like to quote the author's words: "No one escapes the great jaws of the Lord of the earth." Gracias, Eduardo.
Good evening. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Harvard University and to my hermano mayor, David Carrasco, for the kind invitation to be here in this sacred place. Obviously for all scholars, studying Mesoamerica. Okay, I begin. Carlos Navarrete, the famous archaeologist from Guatemala, has examined the roots of the Mexican vision of death, viewed with fascination and curiosity by foreigners. Far from we might expect, the often cited, celebrated, beloved, and never mocked myth of death doesn't date back any earlier than the 1920s. According to Navarrete, in those founding times of the nation amidst a revolutionary mysticism, there was a search for Mexican essence so that the popular arts were revived, particularly the graphic works of José Guadalupe Posada. Sugar skulls, cut out tissue paper skeletons, and engravings of Catrinas, or fancy ladies, thus became exemplary ancestors and sources of inspiration for a multifaceted iconography flooding public buildings, schools, markets, bakeries, and cemeteries every November. In the decades following the revolution, intellectuals such as Diego Rivera could take up this banner, disseminating the new aesthetic of the great beyond to consolidate the myth that death instills little or no fear in Mexicans. Based on this vision, many have wanted to find a long indigenous tradition of friendly, smiling skeletons in the threads of historical continuity. Obviously, extrapolating from the urban context of post-revolutionary Mexico to the pre-Columbian world is going too far. Although it is true that the Mexica worldview have no equivalent to the horrifying image of the hell of our Christian heritage, it would be overly simplistic to say that before the arrival of the Spaniards, no one feared death, or that beings such as Mictlantecutli, the Mexica Lord of Death, did inspire enormous respect in the believer. The complex pre-Columbian conception of death and the other world make any simplistic vision impossible. Numerous studies of indigenous thought reveal elaborate eschatology as well as gods of death with contradictory traits. Even some divine functions may seem paradoxical from our Western perspective. To illustrate this notion, gods of the underworld display a terrifying sight in central Mexico codices where they appear in scenes of death, sacrifice, and destruction. Surprisingly enough, in other images from the same document, these skeletal beings can also be imbued with creative functions, both in the cycle of vegetation as well as in the conception and birth of human beings. For instance, this scene shows Mictlantecutli cutting the umbilical cord of a baby. My main interest today focuses precisely on this dual aspect of the god of death. My reflections will be based on the discovery of two exceptional images of Mictlantecutli in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Mexica Empire. Between 1978 and 82, the Great Temple Project, directed by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, excavated 15 religious buildings of the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan. The House of Eagles is without doubt one of the most interesting in this architectural complex. This building, L-shaped in plan, owes its name to the eagle's heads decorating its main stairway. In 1981, with Eduardo Matos, we explored the interior of the last constructive stage, uncovering a substructure that apparently dates to 1470 AD. This older building was found in a magnificent state of preservation. It consists of several rooms decorated with beautiful paintings and long polychrome bench reliefs. Access was by way of two stairways. To reach the main room, one had to cross a door guarded by two ceramic sculptures representing individuals wearing eagle costumes. From the main room, occupied by a wild altar, one passed into the next rooms by a narrow passageway, flanked by two ceramic skeletons, unfortunately broken by a colonial building. Those one reached a rectangular patio limited by two rooms. Each one of them had a small altar and a pair of ceramic braziers decorated with rain gods' faces shedding tears. In the 90s, and thanks to the collaboration of the National Institute of Anthropology and History and the Moses Mesoamerican Archive, directed by Professor David Carrasco, we were able to continue field work at the House of Eagles to seek a better understanding of the religious significance and functions of the building. Our first task was to reconstruct the ritual activities which were carried out in this place on a daily basis. We cut out a tiny cylindrical piece from each square meter of the stucco floor, retrieving in this way more than 500 samples. By means of microchemical analysis of these samples, we found deposits of carbonates, phosphates, fatty acids, albumin, and other compounds. Once it was transferred to the computer, this information helped us to deduce that specific activities took place in particular parts of the building: the offering of food to the gods, self-sacrifice, and the burning of incense. The next task was to detect and excavate all types of features buried beneath the floors of the House of Eagles. For this purpose, we used a magnetometer, a resistivity meter, and a ground-penetrating radar, instruments which helped us to discover magnetic and electric anomalies produced by several of the buried offerings, a drainage system, and a smaller and older building. We continued to excavate in those places, showing the greatest anomalies. After several years of meticulous work, we were able to record in detail and recover, among other things, 8 offerings and a burial, which were found beneath floors, altars, and staircases. We decided later to excavate several tunnels because the northern half of the House of Eagles is under the street. One of the tunnels was dug to locate the main entrance to the north wing of the building. There, the two sculptures of Mictlantecutli came to light. We detected first the impressive claw of one sculpture, and immediately after the skull of the other. That was a memorable day. The excavation and conservation work took place simultaneously from the very day of the discovery. The restorer's presence was indispensable at every moment due to the poor state of preservation of the two sculptures, both the low temperature at which the pieces were fired, as well as the high level of humidity in the subsoil, turned the ceramic into a highly fragile material. These two phenomena, combined with the tremendous pressure exercised by the weight of the buildings, caused serious damage to the images. Due to the fact that the sculptures were fractured into hundreds of pieces, we decided to free them from top to bottom, dismantling them section by section. You can see in this slide the hip and the legs. After 5 months of work in the tunnel, we managed to completely extract and record them. In the piece of the lab, we continued work. The sculpture's fragility made consolidation of the ceramic indispensable to increase its resistance. The next step was to spread the pieces of each sculpture on the floor to photograph them. Nevertheless, the most complicated task was assembling the pieces of these huge puzzles. At the same time, a dismountable tubular structure was made that would serve to keep the 280 pounds in weight of this piece standing. The two images are so similar that it is easy to confuse them. Both are freestanding anthropomorphic sculptures representing a male figure. They are hieratic, full-bodied representations whose dimensions slightly exceed average Mexica dimensions, 5.7 feet. All the elements of the body observed strict bilateral symmetry. As for their position, the sculptures are standing, facing the forward, flexed arms extending upward, and displaying claws in a position of attack. The head is large in proportion to the body. Dozens of irregular perforations dot the area corresponding to the scalp. They were used to insert curly black hair characterizing Mictlantecutli and other nocturnal terrifying deities. No? The beautiful people had straight hair. The head is distinguished by its prominent ears. The sculptures have a bulky skeletal torso. In the lower end of the sternum, there are two perforations where a cord was knotted that held the trilobate piece representing the liver and the gallbladder. From the torso emerged two massive and very long arms. The robust quality of the hip, legs, and feet form a striking contrast with the skeletal torso of the images. It is evident that the described attributes correspond with the sculptural and pictographic representations of the Lord of the Realm of the Dead. Although representations of this deity are common as a skeletal being, figures such as ours with partially fleshless bodies, which are true studies of corpses in decomposition, predominate. I should mention that during the excavation of one of the ceramic images, we removed the earth covering it and found a gritty substance on the head, shoulders, arms, and back. It was a thin layer, maroon in color, the distribution of which suggested a fluid that had been poured from above. Several samples of this strange maroon-colored material were taken based on the supposition that they were bloody remains in a very poor state of preservation. After a first battery of analysis, high concentrations of iron and albumin were detected, that is to say, the main components of blood. Later, a series of studies were conducted by electrophoresis and immunology. This analysis allowed the indisputable identification of the presence of hemoglobin of human origin. Thus, it was corroborated that the images of the god of death were bathed with blood from sacrificial individuals. This same practice is represented in a scene from the Codex Magliavecchi that is amazing for its extraordinary parallels with the rite that took place in the House of Eagles. One compelling question about our discoveries is why huge livers are present in these representations of underworld beings. We suppose that one of the characteristics of the liver that could have attracted the attention of pre-Columbian peoples the most is the large quantity of blood it contains. Blood flows provided by the hepatic artery and the portal vein perhaps induced indigenous people to associate this organ with the heart, another one of the receptacles of animistic entities. For the Mexica, the Hiyotl, one of the three souls of the body, resided in the liver. Alfredo López Austin has pointed out that for the Nahuas of today, each one of the animistic entities is closely linked to a certain sector of the cosmos and the nuclear family. This allows us to understand why the head, the main site where the tonali resides, was given the name of Ilhuicatl, sky, in pre-Columbian times, and the reasons for the strong link between the sun and the human heart. We might also find a relationship between Hiyotl and the earth and the underworld. Farming was considered the inevitable aggression of man toward the Great Mother, which the Tyler had to wound by inserting the planting stick. Tilling the earth is Elimiki Nahuatl, which literally means to injure the liver, precisely the organ that is the seat of the Hiyotl. Today, we have several studies on the interesting semantic complex of the Hiyotl, which joins the idea of underworld, femininity, growth, passion, and carnal sins, excrement, trash, and death as part of the same logical structure. According to the Mexica, the concept of the areas below was where passions and positive and negative forces joined. So the images of Mictlantecutli in the House of Eagles, terrifying, eager for blood, partially fleshless, with prominent livers, fit into the complex eschatological conception of the underworld, a dark, gloomy, affected place, which at the same time was an inexhaustible source of creative power and origin of the human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your invitation. Thank you, David. It is always a pleasure to read again the papers of Professor Eduardo Matos. You can discover new data hidden in the corners of his masterfully prose, leading to new unsuspected roads. The book you have in your hands, recently translated to English thanks to the great vision and entrepreneurship of David Carrasco and the magnificent work of Scott Sessions, is a sample of the coherency between the strong theoretical foundation of Matos and his wide knowledge of human behavior, not only from the Mesoamerican groups during the pre-Hispanic era, but from a worldwide view. The first chapter is a good example about it, and the one I will focus on today. If you allow me, I will address some of his statements with my own studies. Humans, Heroes, and Gods is a synthetic but broad reflection about what it means to be human, and as if Matos was playing a reductio ad absurdum, what is not. This exercise leads the author to the pinpoint of the entire book, the very conception of death. As if the condition of being human is the fact that we are mortal, Matos pondered how we deposit our secret fears and unachievable hopes into the nature of the divine. One of his strongest statements opens the chapter. Los hombres han creado a los dioses a su imagen y semejanza. Desde siempre, en todos los tiempos y en todas las circunstancias, el hombre ha tratado de responder a las dudas que su propia presencia y ausencia le causa. Some authors choose to fill the papers with strong land but few plants and flowers. Professor Eduardo prefers the opposite, using a brief but powerful bunch of foundational fathers of the modern anthropology, such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, George Fraser, Mircea Eliade, Marcel Mauss, and Joseph Henderson, starts his trip, and us with him, leading us to an interesting voyage from the depths of the heroic path of Gilgamesh, or descending the Mictlan with Quetzalcoatl to the highly heavens of Dante's verses. Matos starts his reflections noticing that the gods in different cultures have similarities. According to human creativity, they are able not only to be far from the realms of death and sometimes reborn, but to create other living creatures. The first thing to be pointed out is the idea of immortality. According to the Bible, the loss of it was a punishment of the sins of Adam and Eve, but also is the longing grievance of Gilgamesh when his teammate Enkidu dies. On the other hand, Mesoamerica, some gods such as the Peu and Gukumats seem to be eternal and presenting the first creational era. They were under charge to build the world and the living entities that will settle the land, but with the restriction of mortality, in order to not to be similar to their creators. Also, Ometecutli and Ometecihuatl, the divine couple in our beliefs, seem to be present in all times. We can add a remark of Matos with the interesting explanation about the origin of human times, of the ecumen, such as Dr. Alfredo López Austin pointed out on his brilliant participation on this cátedra in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City in the fall of 2018. The idea that the sun and its first rising was the starting point of time and the life as we know, with the restriction that all the living beings gain solidity, and with it, the consequence of drying, aging, and eventually dying. Restrictions that define the ecumen and turns itself into the exact opposite of the anecumen, the place and time where the divine sojourn. Here is a quote from the works of Alessandro Cuesto with the actual Nahua people of Tepetzintla, Puebla, about how they view the human body as the same substance of corn, which as the time passes gets dry. El cuerpo carne está como el maíz en constante necesidad de balance, de acuerdo con la medicina tradicional, pues puede ponerse muy seco con la edad, el trabajo, el alcohol, o muy líquido, durante la primera juventud por enfermedades diversas, así como muy caliente o frío. El cuerpo también está hecho parcialmente de tierra. Las excreciones animales y vegetales son a veces llamadas barro o zoquitl y los cadáveres son comidos por la tierra. This turns us back to one line of Matos' work about the famous biblical quote, "From the dust you are." Cuesta found out that the Nahua group acknowledged that a portion of human flesh is composed by lime, and it is an important ingredient of the indigenous cuisine. The notion of earth as part of the human body is also present in the Gilgamesh epic. Matos remarks that Enkidu was made by the gods with mud. In order to address this interesting question, I bring here the study of Dr. David Damsroch, who analyzed the Babylonian masterpiece and underlined that the entire scenario of Gilgamesh is composed by dust, even the bricks that are the foundation of the great wall that surround Uruk, as if they were the reminders that all the human creations are doomed eventually to disappear. The underworld in the tale is referred as the House of Dust and dramatically described by Enkidu, who predicted his upcoming death as revealed in a dream. There, a la casa cuyos habitantes carecen de luz, donde el polvo es su vianda y el barro su manjar. What a hopeless view of the final destination. And don't forget the first attempt to create the human beings according to the Popol Vuh, entities that hadn't achieved to get consistency because they were done with mud. Hicieron la carne del hombre de tierra, de lodo, pero vieron que no estaba bien, pues se deshacía, quedaba blanda, no tenía movimiento, no tenía fuerza, se desmoronaba. El hombre estaba guau, no movía la cabeza, su cara se le iba para un lado, tenía la vista velada, no podía ver hacia atrás. En un principio hablaba, pero no tenía entendimiento. Rápidamente se humedeció dentro del agua y no se pudo sostener. The second property of the divine force related to death is the possibility to reborn, and in some cases to resurrect the dead, as Jesus did in the New Testament with Lazarus and a young man from Naim. Matos set forth the possibility in some cultures that their gods can die, but they can also reborn. On this subject, Matos brings to light the ancient Egyptian myth of Osiris, the resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament, and of course, two of the main myths in Nahua cosmology, the death of Quetzalcoatl on his journey to the Mictlan and the self-sacrifice of Nanahuatzin, and all the other gods during the birth of the fifth son in Teotihuacan. I will not elaborate about these two interesting myths, but I want to point out that also the gods can resurrect. The idea of dying is not of their liking in any case. We can recall the episodes in the Sagun's work where the gods were hit by the arrows of the sun. All decided to sacrifice themselves so the sun can move and the life could flourish. But Xolotl, the twin of Quetzalcoatl, was afraid and tried to escape, hiding between different landscapes. First, he became a double corn cane, named in Nahuatl Xolotl. After he was discovered, he became a double maguey, named Mexolotl. Finally, he turned into an aquatic creature, the axolotl, or ajolote in Spanish, captured and sacrificed. Since then, according to Mercedes de la Garza, this divine dog was doomed to transport the sun during his daily trip to the underworld, relating the abnormality, the darkness, and the death in the same category as part of the nature of the world. Meanwhile, in Greece, the goddess Persephone, daughter of Demeter, was kidnapped by Hades and brought into the underworld to become his wife. Neither her nor her mother were happy with her fate. Even if she was meant to be the almighty queen of the underworld, Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, started then a long and winding road looking for her daughter, disguised as an old lady and leaving the lands sterile to show her rage. Finally, Zeus ordered Athena and Hermes bring the young maid back to her mother, but with one condition. Pero si tan grande tu deseo de separarlos es, volver a subir Proserpina al cielo con una ley aún así cierta. Si ningunos alimentos ha tocado allí con su boca, pues así de las parcas en el pacto precavido sea. As we can read in Ovid's 5th book. The underground rules are not easy to avoid, even for the gods. So the young Persephone, who had already eaten a fruit in the realms of Hades, had to agree to be half of the year with her mother, half with his husband. Another episode involving underworld's food and an unsuccessful attempt to get freed from the chains of death comes from the Kojiki book in Japan. After a painful recovery from the childbirth of Kagutsuchi, the god of fire, his mother finally died. Izanagi, the husband, went to the land of the dead to rescue Izanami, but the goddess had already eaten food from the underworld. Izanagi pleaded for mercy, and finally the wife was able to come back to him. Nevertheless, as in Orpheus' myth, the wife asked not to be seen during several nights because she was changing her body. Impatient, Izanagi caught off guard his wife and discovered her rotting body. Outraged by the impertinent disruption, Izanami sent the kami of the thunder to chase him. Izanagi ran outside the yomi and finally was able to distract his chasers, throwing them food and closing the entrance of the dark land of the dead. Matos ends this chapter recalling the humans that traveled to the underworld and were able to come back alive, the heroes, on which I suspect is one of his favorite themes due to the long pages he devotes to. Matos chose here 3 heroes from the classical books of the ancient history and one of the masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance, Odysseus, Heracles, Aeneas, and Dante. Whether they dare to go to this unattractive resort looking for advice, for glory, or to fulfill a duty, the 4 stories let us know the geography of the underworld, the substance of the deceased, and even the sovereign wisdom of the people who had already faced the death. Showing his skills as a teacher of hundreds of novice students like me, Matos finalized this part with a brief table comparing the levels of the underworld of Dante's Comedy and the Mictlán according to Codex Vaticano VI and Sagun's book. In addition, he proposes 10 points of similarities between the different myths related to the place of death. I only will talk about the 9th. You cannot come back from the underworld except for the capacity of a limited number of living humans considered as heroes, and I must adhere, not without a bruise. With some honorable exceptions, most of the journeys of the underworld take a toll. Quetzalcoatl falls and breaks the bones he was trying to rescue. The potion for the eternal youth was stolen by a snake while Gilgamesh was bathing. The impatient Orpheus lost his beloved Eurydice. Maybe the lesson we must learn is to use a guide for. Athena and Hermes accompanied Heracles. Circe gave Odysseus the direction to reach the land of the dead. Aeneas looked for the Sibyl of Cumae, being thus eternalized in the unsurpassed hypology of Virgil, Ivan d'Oscuri, sola sub nocte per umbrem, masterfully studied by Jorge Luis Borges. Xolotl followed the footsteps of Quetzalcoatl. Virgil helped Dante. The twins Hunahpu and Xbalamque had each other. And us, we have Professor Matos to be our guide with his patience, generosity, and wisdom. I want to finalize my intervention saying that it's not all about sadness and sorrow in the underworld. Menipo, the Greek philosopher, teaches us that we can have fun there according to Lucian of Samosata, the Syrian satirist. First, you can trick the fearful Caronte, not paying the fare to be transported. Also, you can gossip about the wealthy people, the politicians, and the vain scholars, not to mention the famous beauties that ended exactly as the other humans, in bare bones and meager schools. After all, everyone ends up in the same place without any of the riches and glory of the ephemeral human world. We can also recall on this matter the pranks suffered by the Mayan twins Hunahpu and Bukub Hunahpu as soon as they arrived to the Xibalbá, according to the Popol Vuh. First of all, the lords of the underworld disguised some wooden dolls to fool the twins. Later, they asked them to have a seat. Pero el banco que les ofrecían era de piedra ardiente y en el banco se quemaron. Se pusieron a dar vueltas en el banco, pero no se aliviaron, y si no se hubieran levantado, se les habrían quemado las asentaderas. ¡Auch! Los de Xibalbá se echaron a reír de nuevo, se morían de la risa, se retorcían del dolor que les causaba la risa en las entrañas, en la sangre y en los huesos, riéndose todos los señores de Xibalbá. The inhabitants of the underworld can be roguish too. Matos leads us to the very roots of the beliefs about what human thinks is the purpose of dying, and also that all of these different but surprisingly similar answers whispers about what true human nature is, leaving us his readers with deep reflections. Even when Gilgamesh came back with his unfulfilled mission, finally he learned the lesson. It is not allowed to the humans to avoid our mortality. The only solution is to get immortal in a new form, the form of memory that goes from mouth to mouth, from page to page, from sculpture to sculpture, from brick to brick, until the end of time. Thank you.
What an honor. Thank you for this opportunity. I love being referred to as young at 57. If I were French, I'd be retired and living on the Riviera right now, the Mexican Riviera. I come to this place as a historian, but not as a historian of Mesoamerica. I've been a student of these great historians of Mesoamerica for a very long time. And as an outsider, I'd like to place death in Mesoamerica in a planetary context, not just an ancient or pre-modern one. This book speaks to our times, to us, to all humanity. My first memories of Matos in Boulder, Colorado, as an undergraduate, along with Scott Sessions, those olden days, was of his pipe. I had this feeling that true intellectuals, Carrasco, Eliade, Matos, had to be bald men with pipes. And then along came Dr. Loco to turn it all upside down, the trickster. We approach our planet in darkness and in light, courtesy of NASA, to look for Mexico, to look for the center, to look for a place to land, amid the water, amid the mountains, in this great valley, with these twin cities. We try to aterrizar, to land amid the waters, between the volcanoes. Notice that pass, known now as the Paso de Cortés. Yonder lies Mictlán. Oops, we went a little too deep. Met the Axolot. But he doesn't mind, our furry little aquatic friend. But here we are, Templo Mayor, dead center of Mesoamerica. This is the world of Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, a romantic materialist who found himself stranded entre Marx y una mujer quebrada, desarticulada. What could the moon goddess tell him? What did her sacrifice mean? What did it signify? This buried world beneath Mexico City proved uncanny, quite dead, yet weirdly alive. The rains still fell, but they couldn't drown the past. The offering, says Matos, is a true microcosm. Matos has said that he once thought the archaeologist ought to be like a surgeon. telling the patient's loved ones to wait outside until he was finished. It was an open gallery, though, excavating the Templo Mayor. It taught him otherwise. People came to see, not just famous people, the Queen of Spain, the King, Maria Felix, Gabo, Octavio Paz. No, but ordinary people came. They brought offerings. He said, "This is a foreign world to you." But they replied, "No, Professor, what's really ours is this. This Mexico is ours." No other pre-Columbian culture that I know of worked so hard to render living nature, fellow creatures, in stone and at this scale. Matos strains to explain environmental history as it really ought to be. And yet, he also acknowledges precursors. He dialogues with the dead in several overlapping registers. The Teotihuacan-Tenochtitlan dialectic, constantly engaging. The green area hypothesis, where springs produce life and life springs eternal. I could have sworn that was Gamio, the archaeologist. We have to go back for a second. Are you with me? I think Magritte was sitting with Gamio. And then there's the dialectic that ties the fall of Tenochtitlan to the rise of Mexico City. It is ethnographic and also political. The struggle continues. Amid rupture, continuity. And I find in this book this constant tension between change and continuity, which is the historian's duality, change and continuity. I won't linger here on method. I'm the last speaker. We don't want to do this. But to me, Death in Mesoamerica, more than any of Matos's other synthetic works, feels deeply historical, soulfully historical. As he puts it, to paraphrase, the earthly artifact confirms the text. More often than not, at least in the case of the Templo Mayor, the artifact confirms the text. And yet Matos is the first to admit, as he did tonight, that we delude ourselves when we think we are certain, when we become cocksure. This is science. I love his commitment to science, but always with this humble admission that his work too will someday be buried. He has written on the history of archaeology and placed himself in context. And this is an old story, one that goes back to the end of colonial times and the very earliest days of the nation of Mexico. The museum is a problem, but it's also a possibility. The showstopper, Coatlicue, she of the serpent skirt, behold, she is awesome. Any of you who have stood before her have trembled. But beneath it all, beneath her, and all important, is Tlaltecutli, sometimes called the earth monster. You've seen images already. Matos reminds us that all life demands sacrifice. All fields demand fertilization. This dual deity feeds upon us, devours us, in order to give birth again and continue the cycle, to continue life. As Matos puts it bluntly, and you've already heard this repeated, nobody escapes the great jaws of the Lord of the earth. Death awaits us, or rather, another inseparable couple, a duality, awaits us in Mictlan. Mexico City may be America's answer to Rome. Rome on speed. and Tlaltecutli may be its version of Gaia, the whole living planet together, fetid and fecund. The future is uncertain, so we look to the past, is what Matos said. But is the future so uncertain? Haven't the prophets spoken? The scientists? Or can we yet learn from our ancestors, they who held the two halves together despite the tension, or rather recognizing the inevitability of the tension? Perhaps this was the genius of the Stone Age, of Stone Age economics. And so we thank you, Don Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, for your commitment, your sacrifice, your text in context. We are forever in your debt.
So let me just say one final word here. So you took a look at the people up here on the stage, and you'll notice that there is a stronger presence of Mexicans. Years ago, when I was coming up in this field, I went to Mexico. I was studying in this country with some very fine scholars, North American scholars, and I felt that there wasn't enough credit given to what Mexicans themselves were not only excavating, but interpreting. And I had been in Mexico a number of times since I was 13, because my father was there as the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana, teaching Mexican coaches how to coach. And whenever I was with Mexican graduate students, even in seminars, I was so impressed by how much more they knew than what I was hearing even in universities up here. I made a commitment that I was going to reach across the border and find colleagues who I would then make sure they were always in the front row of everything we did at the Mesoamerican Archive, that Mexicans themselves would be present to not only talk about their scholarship, but to have dialogues with them. And this is, in a sense, part of the origin of what you see tonight and the Mesoamerican Archive. Eduardo Matos took my hand, pulled me into his situation, introduced me to generations of people, and we decided as a Mexican American and a Mexican that we were going to make a contribution in that country and in this country to Mesoamerican studies, but we were going to make sure that not only did we always pass along what we were learning to new generations, but that Mexicans were going to be in the front row. This was my commitment. This was something that I felt was crucial. And it really turned out to be a good move, as you can see, because our knowledge has been expanded so much. And together we also published the encyclopedia, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures. If you looked at the Handbook of Middle American Indians, which was a wonderful resource years before, and you looked at the editors, I don't think there's a single Mexican in that editorship list. When we did the Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures, more than 50% of the people who were the editors were people from Mexico and Mesoamerica. And this is one of the things that I think is really important going forward. I know some of the other people in this room who are archaeologists, David Carballo and others, absolutely agree with me. And it's really important to understand that whatever new river or new development will take place, it will only take place if there's this type of cooperation and collegial work, and the realization that who's doing the work ought to be able also to tell you the story about the work. So I want to thank Jose Cuellar, Julian Cancino, Sarah Faber, Kate Royce, Bob DeVoe, Sita Lean, and again, I want to say Jose Antonio Alonso and Karen Beckman, thank you for the very memorable hospitality during Harvard's visits to Mexico City. But most of all, let's give a round of applause and thank these people for all that they've done.
Sponsors: David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, the Moses Mesoamerican Archive, Harvard Divinity School, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, and the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard.